Hello students, this is the third and final video on the classical theory of income and employment determination. In this video, we shall be discussing money neutrality, wage price flexibility and full employment, and Keynes' criticism of the classical theory. Firstly, let us see what we mean by money neutrality. In the classical model, money is considered to be neutral. This means that changes in the quantity of money affect only the nominal variables, that is money wages, nominal interest rate, etc., while the real variables such as real income, level of employment, real wage rate, real rate of interest, etc., remain unaffected. In other words, money is neutral in its effect on the real variables of the economy. To understand money neutrality, we consider the diagram we had used earlier for the graphical representation of the classical model. We are familiar with this diagram, which consists of four parts, as we can see, parts A, B, C and D. And parts A and B represent the real part of the model, and parts C and D represent the monetary part of the model. And from parts A and B, we can easily determine the equilibrium values of the real variables, that is level of employment N0, real wage rate W by P0, and real output Y0. And from the monetary parts, we can determine the equilibrium values of the monetary variables, that is price level P0 and money wages W0. You can go through the previous video to understand how the equilibrium values of the variables are determined. Now let us consider an increase in exogenously given money supply. Let the money supply now increase from M0 to M1 as shown in part C of the figure. We can see that money supply increases from M0 to M1. An increase in exogenously given money supply now leads to an increase in price level from P0 to say P1, because we know this from the quantity theory of money. Now this increase in price level therefore now leads to an increase in money income from Py0 to Py1. But since the level of real output Y0 is the same, the increased money income Py1 is the product of P1 and Y0. So we can see from the figure that Py1 is equal to P1 into Y0. This means that the same output Y0 is now sold at a higher price P1. Now how does this increase in money supply and price level affect the real variables? For this we consider part B of the figure, which shows us the labor market equilibrium. Now the increase in price level from P0 to P1 leads to a decrease in the real wage from W by P0 to W0 by P1, as we can see in the figure. We see that W0 by P1 lies below W by P0. Now at this decreased real wage, we can see that labor demand exceeds labor supply by an amount AB. And according to the classicals, this will now lead to an increase in money wage from W0 to say W1, since wages are perfectly flexible in the classical model. So in response to an excess demand, initially we find that the wage rate increases from W0 to W1. But the classicals also said that this increase in money wage is in equal proportion to the increase in price level, which means that the real wage W by P remains the same. So the increased real wage W1 by P1 would now be equal to the initial real wage W0 by P0. We can see this in the figure that W by P0 is equal to W by P1. So at this increased real wage, we see we have moved back to the initial equilibrium and the excess demand for labor has been cleared. So labor market equilibrium has been restored and the equilibrium level of employment remains the same at N0, and the equilibrium level of output also remains the same at Y0. Now what is the value of this increased money wage W1? We can easily find that out from part D of the figure. At the increased price level P1, with the help of the diagonal line, we can find out that the increased money wages W1, as we can see in part D of the figure. So we see that when exogenously given money supply increases, only the nominal variables change. That is, nominal or money wage increases from W0 to W1 and price level increases from P0 to P1. But the real variables, that is real wage rate, level of employment and real output, remains the same. That means money has no effect on the real variables in the model. This is what we mean by money neutrality. We now move on to wage price flexibility and full employment. An important assumption of the classical theory is wage price flexibility. What do we mean by this? Wage price flexibility means that wages and prices are perfectly flexible in upward and downward direction. That is, when demand and supply conditions change in the relevant markets, wages and prices also change. This means that wages and prices can increase or decrease without any restriction. The classicals also believed that given this wage price flexibility, the economy always tends towards full employment equilibrium, which is the only equilibrium possible. This means that the economy cannot be in disequilibrium. The classicals also believed that if there is any disequilibrium or involuntary unemployment in the economy, the natural economic forces emanating from this wage price flexibility will eliminate it and restore full employment. So they said that unemployment or a situation of disequilibrium is temporary and will be eliminated naturally and automatically. Let us now see how wage price flexibility leads to full employment. For this, we consider the labor market equilibrium diagram. Here we can see the labor demand and labor supply curves ND and NS, which intersect at the point E, so that the equilibrium employment is N0 and equilibrium wage rate is W by P0. Let us now consider a maladjustment in the labor market. Let the real wage rate increase to W by P1. At this increased real wage, there is an excess supply of labor measured by the amount AB, as we can see in the figure. Excess supply means that there are more people wanting to work than are being demanded. So AB actually measures the volume of unemployment. Now, according to the classicals, this situation will not persist. The classicals assumed that there is perfect competition everywhere, so there is perfect competition in the labor market as well. This means that the laborers are competing with each other for jobs. So each laborer would take up jobs even at a lower wage rate rather than remain idle, because he knows that if he doesn't take up the job, then someone else will. So he prefers to work rather than remain idle even at a lower wage rate. So the first thing that happens when there is an excess supply of labor is that money wage rate W falls. Now, whether the labor demand will increase to absorb this excess supply and restore the initial full employment equilibrium will depend on the effect of a fall in this W on the real wage rate W by P, which depends on the effect of a fall in W on the price level P. Now, classicals were not very clear about the effect of a fall in W on P, because they believed in the quantity theory of money, which we know says that money is the only factor affecting the price level. So when money wage rate W falls, they said that price level would remain the same. So when W falls, real wage rate W by P also falls and labor demand increases, since we can see that labor demand is an inverse function of the real wage rate. So the excess supply gets cleared. If there is still some excess supply, then the same process is repeated, and this continues till all the excess supply is cleared and the economy reaches the equilibrium position. So we see that equilibrium is attained through wage price flexibility. Keynes, however, objected to this. He said that the classicals were applying microeconomic reasoning to a macroeconomic framework. He also said that if the money wage rate W throughout the economy falls, then we cannot assume demand to remain unaffected. This is because as money wage declines, people's incomes also decline and aggregate demand declines. So product prices also decline in response to a decrease in aggregate demand. So When economy-wide wage rate W falls, price falls proportionately, so that W by P, the real wage, remains the same at W by P1, and we cannot move out of this situation. So unemployment in the economy, which is measured by the gap AB in the previous figure, the previous slide we can see, it cannot be removed. So the argument made by the classicals that there is always full employment in the economy is not true according to Keynes. However, it may be argued that when W falls and P falls as a result of a fall in W, as argued by Keynes, people will now be spending less than before in buying the same goods because of a fall in price. So idle balances will be created in the hands of at least some people. Now, according to the quantity theory of money, no rational person wants to hold idle balances because money is barren and it yields no return. So people will spend the excess money which they have, that is the idle balances, immediately in buying goods. But since the output cannot be increased beyond the full employment level, that is the level Y0, there will now be an upward pressure on prices due to increased demand or increased spending. So price does not fall proportionately when wage rate W falls as suggested by Keynes. So the real wage W by P does not remain the same, but it decreases, and the excess supply is cleared and full employment is restored as suggested by the classicals. So this is how wage price flexibility guarantees full employment equilibrium in the classical model. Finally, we move on to Keynes' criticism of the classical model. Firstly, Keynes regarded full employment as a special situation and underemployment equilibrium as the general situation. He said that the classical assumption of full employment equilibrium was an unrealistic assumption. He said that it is the deficiency of aggregate demand which leads to involuntary unemployment in the economy, and the existence of involuntary unemployment proves that underemployment equilibrium is a normal situation and full employment equilibrium is abnormal and accidental. Secondly, Keynes refuted the Say's law of markets, which says that supply creates its own demand. He said that it is true that the incomes earned by the various factors of production are equal to the value of the output produced by them, but this does not necessarily mean that the factors of production will spend their entire income on goods and services. He talked about an important concept known as the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, which measures the proportion of increased income spent on consumption. And he said that this MPC is less than 1, which means that people do not spend their entire increased income on consumption goods. They save a part of the increased income, and whenever there is saving, there is a leakage in the income stream so that aggregate demand declines. The classicals believed that the saved income is automatically invested, so that aggregate demand remains the same. But Keynes says that this is not necessarily happen. That savings and investment would be equal to each other is not always true, because savings and investment are two completely different functions and they depend on different factors. So whenever there is saving, there is a leakage in the income stream, and this leads to deficiency of aggregate demand, and this leads to general overproduction and hence general unemployment. So the economy does not function according to the Say's law as was believed by the classicals. Thirdly, Keynes objected the laissez-faire doctrine and advocated state intervention for adjusting supply and demand within the economy through fiscal and monetary measures. The classicals believed in the laissez-faire doctrine and said that it was automatic and self-adjusting, leading to full employment equilibrium. But Keynes said that if the system had been automatic and self-adjusting, then the Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s would not have occurred in the American economy. So he was in favor of the state intervention and he opposed the laissez-faire doctrine. Fourthly, Keynes objected the classical view that savings and investment were functions of the interest rate and that the equality between them was brought about by the interest rate mechanism. Keynes said that savings depended upon the level of income and investment was determined by the marginal efficiency of capital. And he said that it is the variations in income rather than changes in interest rate that brings about equality between savings and investment. Fifthly, Keynes objected the classical view that money was a mere medium of exchange, and he stressed on the speculative demand for money. Classicals believed only in the transaction's motive for holding money. That is, they said that money served only as a medium of exchange. They said that holding idle money was useless because it did not yield anything in return. However, Keynes did not agree with this view. He said that besides being a medium of exchange, money also had other functions, and he believed in the precautionary and speculative motives for holding money. That is, he said that money could be stored and used in future for emergencies, or it could be used to earn some interest income. And classicals also regarded money as being neutral. That is, changes in money supply affect only the price level and not the real variables like employment output and interest rate, as we have seen earlier. Keynes, however, criticized this view of the classicals, and he integrated the monetary theory with the theory of value. And finally, Keynes refuted the Pigovian formulation that a cut in money wages could achieve full employment in the economy. According to Pigou, when there is an unemployment, wage rate will decline, which will increase the demand for labor by reducing the costs, so that unemployment would be removed. But Keynes said that although this might be true for a particular industry, it is not so for the entire economy. Because when there is a general wage cut, income of the workers is reduced, which leads to a fall in aggregate demand, hence fall in employment. He also said that in recent times, trade unions are powerful and they resist wage cuts. So wage rates cannot fall below a certain level. And they are not perfectly flexible, as was assumed by the classicals. And Keynes believed that it is the deficiency of aggregate demand which leads to unemployment, and unemployment can be removed by raising the level of aggregate demand through appropriate monetary and fiscal policies through state intervention.